He and his wife just wanted to clean the pool, but they found poison in the drain. It was no accident. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The last warm weekend of the season had arrived, and with it came the ritual that Emily and Dan had repeated every autumn since they bought the house. The air carried the faint sharpness of October, a mix of drying leaves and wood smoke from chimneys down the street, and the suburban neighborhood felt quieter than usual. Somewhere in the distance, a leaf blower buzzed, the dull mechanical drone blending with the rustle of trees. In their backyard, the pool stood still. A perfect oval of dark water ringed with beige tiles that had warmed under the weak afternoon sun. For Emily, the pool had always been a symbol of how far they had come together, a shared dream they made real after years of small apartments and saving every penny. It wasn't huge or fancy, but it was theirs, and every summer it was the center of their life. Dan tugged off the heavy vinyl cover, folding it in sections and shaking off the film of dew. Emily knelt to help him, her knees pressing against the cool stone. Together, they dragged it toward the garage, where it would be stored until spring. The smell of chlorine was faint. Not unpleasant, but sharper than usual. Dan noticed it too, though he said nothing, assuming it was just the stagnant water giving off a stronger scent after sitting untouched for days. When the cover was finally out of the way, the water reflected the dim sky, still and glassy, except for a faint ripple where the pump had begun to draw. Dan adjusted the hose that led to the drain, making sure it was angled away from the flower beds. He liked to take care of this himself rather than pay for pool service, and Emily always admired how thorough he was with every step. They had done this enough times that they both knew the rhythm. Start the pump. Wait as the water level dropped, skim off any floating leaves, and scrub the tiles once the bottom was exposed. At first, everything seemed routine. The pump hummed with a steady, low vibration, and the water level sank inch by inch. Emily crouched to gather leaves with the skimmer, her mind wandering toward the coming week, the errands they had to run, the upcoming birthday dinner for her sister. Then she noticed something strange about the way the surface looked. The ripples seemed to glisten unnaturally, as though a thin film clung to the water. When she moved the skimmer through it, the film broke into streaks rather than dispersing. She frowned and leaned closer, catching a whiff of something unpleasant. It was a sharp, chemical odor, not like the ordinary smell of pool chlorine. Dan came over and crouched beside her, sniffing the air. There was a faint metallic edge to the smell, as though rust had been mixed with bleach. By the time the water dropped to mid-level, a murky haze had appeared near the deep end. At first they thought it might be algae bloom, but algae was usually green or brown, and this was pale, almost gray-white. As more water drained, the haze settled into a sludge around the drain, clinging to the bottom in irregular patches. Emily felt an uneasy tightness in her chest. The closer she got, the more her eyes began to water. Her throat burned slightly, and a bitter taste coated the back of her tongue. Dan stood back and wiped his nose with the back of his hand, noticing that even from a few feet away, he could smell the acrid sting of chemicals. "This isn't right," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her, and turned off the pump. The hum died, leaving behind a strange stillness, broken only by the distant noise of children playing on the next street. They both stood there, looking at the bottom of the pool. The residue seemed to shimmer faintly in the remaining water, as if it were a fine powder that refused to dissolve. It gathered in clusters that slowly slid toward the center, pooling around the drain. Dan fetched the long-handled skimmer again, lowering it carefully into the shallow end and sweeping toward the deep one. The net came up with a clump of the gray substance, wet and sticky, clinging to the mesh. It looked like damp plaster or wet sand, but smelled sharply chemical, enough that Emily took a step back. Neither of them wanted to touch it with their bare hands. Dan turned toward the garage and returned with a plastic storage container, the kind they used for screws and small tools. He knocked the net gently against the edge of the container until the sludge slid inside, then sealed it with its tight-fitting lid. The smell lessened, but it still lingered in the air. They didn't speak much after that. Instead, they went about their usual cleaning with mechanical focus, skimming off the remaining debris and rinsing the tiles with a hose. Emily's hands shook slightly as she coiled the garden hose. The yard, which usually felt safe and familiar, now seemed strange, hostile even. That night, the smell clung to her memory as she tried to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the residue spreading like ink, coating the tiles, seeping into the concrete. She thought about her nephews, who had spent hours splashing here just a few weeks ago, laughing as they jumped from the diving board. The thought of children playing in water that might have been poisoned made her stomach twist. Dan lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling. He kept replaying the image of the sludge in the skimmer, the way it clung to the mesh like something alive. He thought about the dog that had been sick last month after drinking from the pool and how they had assumed it was spoiled food. Maybe it hadn't been. When Emily finally drifted into a fitful sleep, she dreamed of the pool again. But this time, the water was perfectly clear, reflecting the night sky. Only when she looked closer did she see a pale layer at the bottom, glowing faintly, as though warning her to stay away. She woke with a start, heart pounding, and knew that whatever they had found could not be ignored. The morning came gray and quiet, as though the world outside the bedroom window had been muted. Emily lay awake long before sunrise, listening to the faint creak of the house as it shifted with the chill. She could not shake the images from the night before. The grayish sludge at the bottom of the pool, the chemical bite in the air, the way her throat had burned. When she finally rose, she moved carefully so as not to wake Dan, though she knew he was not really asleep. His breathing had been too uneven for hours. By the time the sun broke over the rooftops, Dan was dressed and already in the garage, searching for something to secure the container they had sealed the previous evening. The plastic box was sitting on the workbench, its lid fogged on the inside from whatever reaction was still happening with the damp residue. He double-bagged it in heavy contractor's trash bags and taped them shut. The act felt grimly official, as though he were handling hazardous evidence. When he came inside, his face was drawn, jaw tight. Over breakfast, neither of them had much appetite. The coffee tasted faintly metallic to Emily, though she knew it was only in her head. She could not rid herself of the smell from the pool. It seemed to have followed them into the kitchen, embedded in her memory, if not the air itself. They agreed that Dan would drive the sample to the lab, where a colleague of his friend worked. It was the sort of place that normally tested soil or well water for contaminants, but he was sure they could run a basic analysis and tell them what they were dealing with. He left soon after, placing the package carefully in the trunk of the car, as if afraid it might release more of its contents if disturbed. Emily watched from the kitchen window as he drove away. A faint trail of condensation puffing from the car's tailpipe in the cool air. Then, she turned toward the backyard. The pool looked still, deceptively serene. With most of the water gone, it resembled a gaping blue pit. The residue remained clustered near the drain, pale against the darker surface of the wet plaster. Emily put on rubber gloves and dragged the hose closer, spraying the tiles along the edges in an attempt to wash away what she could. But the smell seemed to intensify when the water hit the surface, rising in a chemical cloud that made her step back and cover her nose with the crook of her arm. She left the hose running for a few minutes, letting fresh water dilute whatever lingered. but even then she felt the sting in her throat. The hours dragged. She tried to distract herself by tidying the house, but every sound made her flinch: the rattle of a neighbor's gate, the bark of a dog, the rumble of a delivery truck passing by. When her phone finally buzzed, she nearly dropped it. It was Dan, his voice low and measured, though she could hear the tension behind it. The lab had finished preliminary tests faster than expected, and the results were alarming. The sample, the technician said, contained a cocktail of industrial pesticides and a herbicide that was not intended for domestic use at all. In high concentration, exposure could cause chemical burns on skin, severe respiratory irritation, and long-term damage if ingested. It was not the sort of compound one could buy in a hardware store without special permits. Whoever had introduced it to the pool had done so deliberately, using a substance designed to kill weeds or invasive plants on a large scale. Emily sat heavily at the kitchen table after she hung up, her legs suddenly weak. The room felt smaller, pressing in on her. She imagined her nephews splashing in that water only weeks ago, the dog lapping at it on hot afternoons. The thought of what could have happened made her stomach turn. She pictured news headlines, hospital rooms, terrible outcomes that had been avoided only by chance because the season had ended and no one had gone swimming in days. When Dan returned home, he placed the printed report from the lab on the table. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. Together, they read through the findings, each line confirming that this was not some accidental contamination. The concentration was too high, the mix too specific. Someone had put it there. They sat in silence for a long time, the house eerily quiet, except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. Slowly, the memories of the past months began to surface. The argument with their neighbor about the fence that had leaned during the summer storm. The time someone left a note in their mailbox complaining about noise from a late-night gathering. The sideways glances exchanged across the yard when tree branches from Emily's garden fell over the property line. None of it had ever seemed serious enough to imagine retaliation, and yet the evidence was sitting in front of them. Dan stood and walked to the sliding door, looking out toward the pool. The afternoon sun glinted off the wet surface, and for a moment he imagined the residue glowing faintly, like a warning. He knew they could not just leave it at that. If someone had done this once, they could do it again. Perhaps when children were around, when no one was home to notice. Emily joined him at the window, crossing her arms over her chest. Her fear had turned into something colder, sharper. She no longer felt safe in her own yard. She kept thinking about the dog's sudden sickness a few weeks earlier, how its gums had turned pale before it recovered. What if that had been the first sign? What if this had been happening for longer than they realized? As the sun dipped lower, casting the yard in long shadows, Dan made up his mind. They could not rely on coincidence to protect them. He would install cameras, several of them, with motion sensors and night vision. They would know if anyone came near the pool again. Emily nodded, her face pale but resolute. The decision felt like crossing an invisible line, turning their home into a watch post, but there was no other choice. They could not confront anyone without proof, and they needed more than a lab report to take to the police. That night, as they lay in bed, the hum of distant traffic mixed with the faint chirp of crickets outside. Emily stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She thought about how the yard had always been a place of comfort, how many evenings they had spent there with friends, music, and laughter. Now it felt exposed, vulnerable. She imagined someone moving through the shadows with a canister in hand, pouring poison into the water while they slept inside unaware. Dan turned to her in the dark and took her hand, but neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The next day would be devoted to transforming their yard into something it had never been before, a place under watch, a place where every movement would be recorded, because trust had been replaced by fear. The next morning dawned with a brittle chill, the kind that hinted that autumn had fully taken hold. Dan rose early, unable to stay in bed any longer, and began making a list of what they would need. He wanted cameras with motion detection, infrared capability, and enough storage to keep the recordings for weeks at a time. He searched online for recommendations and read reviews as the coffee grew cold on the counter beside him. By the time Emily joined him in the kitchen, he had a plan in place. They drove to the nearest hardware store after breakfast, the streets lined with trees that had begun to drop their leaves in earnest. The air smelled faintly of damp soil and burning wood. Inside the store, the shelves were stacked high with boxes of security systems, some simple and cheap, others professional grade. Dan chose a set that included 4 cameras, a recording hub, and a mobile app for alerts. It felt strange and slightly sobering to spend money on surveillance equipment for their quiet suburban yard, but the memory of the lab report left little room for hesitation. Back home, he laid out the equipment on the dining room table and began the careful work of assembling and configuring it. Emily followed him outside, holding a small step ladder, ready to help. They decided on the placement together. One camera above the back door with a clear view of the pool, another near the garage pointing across the yard, a third facing the side gate, and the last mounted high enough on the fence post to capture anyone who might try to climb over. The installation took most of the afternoon. Dan measured angles, checked the range of motion sensors, and calibrated each lens so that no dark corners were left unwatched. Emily fetched tools and held the ladder steady, glancing frequently over her shoulder toward the neighboring yards. Each screw driven into the wood felt like a statement, a declaration that their sense of safety had been taken from them and had to be rebuilt piece by piece. When the sun dipped low, the cameras were finally online. The app on Dan's phone showed 4 crystal-clear images of their property from different angles, and the small green lights on each camera blinked softly like watchful eyes. Emily stood in the doorway, looking out at the yard, which seemed somehow altered. It was still the same space where they had spent countless summer evenings, but now there was an invisible layer of vigilance draped over it, as though the house itself had grown suspicious. That night, Dan left his phone on the nightstand, with the volume turned up. They went to bed earlier than usual, both exhausted, but unable to fully relax. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts for Emily, punctuated by the occasional buzz of a notification. Each time, it was just a neighborhood cat passing by, or a tree branch swaying in the wind. By morning, the footage revealed nothing unusual. The days that followed were slow and tense. Every morning began with Dan reviewing the previous night's recordings, scrubbing through hours of still images and occasional flashes of movement. Emily went about her chores with an undercurrent of wariness, startled by the smallest noises. A gate clicking shut, a car door slamming down the street. Even the laughter of children playing outside sounded slightly ominous, as though the world had tilted and could not be trusted. On the 4th night, something changed. The notification came just after midnight, when the house was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. Dan grabbed the phone and saw that one of the cameras near the fence had been triggered. He sat up, adrenaline surging, and motioned for Emily to stay quiet. Together, they watched the live feed. In the grainy infrared image, a shape appeared near the fence line. At first, it was nothing more than a shifting shadow, but then it resolved into the figure of a person standing very still. The figure lingered there for nearly a minute, as though listening, then slowly moved along the fence before disappearing out of frame. No face could be seen, no clear detail beyond the outline of a jacket and hat, but the presence alone was enough to confirm what they had feared. Someone had been near their yard in the middle of the night, with no reason to be there. The next day, Dan adjusted the cameras, narrowing the field of view so that they would capture closer detail near the pool and the fence. He checked the motion sensitivity levels twice, determined that if the figure came back, they would have more than a blurry outline to show for it. Emily spent the day with a knot in her stomach, glancing out the windows every few minutes. She could not shake the feeling that whoever had come near the yard was not finished. 2 nights later, the alert came again. This time, the camera angle captured more. The figure returned, but now he carried something, a container, dark and square-shaped, held in one hand. He paused at the fence, glanced around, then climbed over with surprising ease. The camera caught the moment he dropped down onto the grass, walked straight toward the pool, and crouched near the deep end. Emily and Dan watched from the safety of their bedroom, hearts hammering. The man unscrewed the container and tilted it slightly, as if preparing to pour whatever was inside into the water. The image was clear enough now to make out the line of his shoulders, the shape of his face as he glanced over his shoulder. Then, as though sensing the house was awake, he froze. The movement had triggered more cameras, and the lights inside the house reflected faintly on the glass doors as Emily stood in the hallway. The figure straightened abruptly, clutched the container, and fled, running back to the fence and clambering over with the speed of someone who knew exactly where to place his hands and feet. The footage continued to record until the yard was empty again. When the silence returned, Dan exhaled slowly, his palms slick with sweat. He rewound the video and played it again, frame by frame, until there was no doubt left in either of their minds. The man's face was captured clearly enough now to recognize him. It was the neighbor who lived 2 houses down, the same man who had argued with Dan about the fence during the summer storm, the one who had left an angry note about noise in their mailbox. Seeing him in the act sent a cold shock through Emily's chest. The anger she had tried to suppress for weeks came rushing back, mingled with fear. She felt no triumph at having proof, only a grim, hollow certainty. They had caught him, but that meant something darker was true. Someone they saw almost every day, someone who waved from his driveway and mowed his lawn on Saturdays, had climbed their fence in the dead of night to poison their water. The camera continued to blink softly outside, but the yard no longer seemed like a place they could step into without thinking. Emily pulled the curtains closed, shutting out the night and the view of the pool. She knew that tomorrow would bring decisions they could no longer avoid. The evidence was clear, and they would have to act on it. Whatever uneasy peace they had shared with their neighbors was over. Morning broke with a pale, cold light that seemed to drain all warmth from the house. Emily and Dan had not slept much after what they had witnessed, and the decision to involve the authorities had settled on them like a heavy weight. It was no longer simply a fear or a suspicion. They had proof, and proof demanded action. Dan collected the printed lab results, the memory card from the cameras, and the notes he had made about the dates and times when the residue had first been discovered. Each item was placed carefully into a folder. Not unlike how an attorney might prepare for a case, the very act of organizing it made the situation feel more real, as though they had crossed into territory from which there was no turning back. They drove together to the local police station, the silence between them punctuated only by the steady thrum of the tires on the asphalt. The streets were quiet, Sunday morning calm spreading across the neighborhood. But Emily could not shake the image of their neighbor climbing over the fence. She pictured him again and again, the way he had crouched near the pool, the container in his hand, the quickness of his retreat. The station stood squat and nondescript on the corner of Main Street, its flag fluttering lazily in the breeze. Dan parked, and for a moment they sat in the car, gathering their courage. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. A young officer at the front desk looked up as they entered, his expression polite but faintly curious, when Dan explained that they needed to file a report for deliberate poisoning. The words sounded strange even as they were spoken, but soon they were led into a small interview room with pale walls and a metal table. Dan spread out the contents of the folder, explaining step by step what they had found, how they had taken a sample, the results from the laboratory, and finally the footage from the cameras. The officer who took their statement listened without interruption, occasionally nodding and jotting notes on a pad. When he reviewed the video, his expression changed from professional detachment to something sharper. The images were undeniable, clear enough to show the neighbor's face, the container, the very act of intrusion. He assured them that the evidence would be logged and that an investigator would be assigned immediately to follow up. The hours that followed were a blur of paperwork, signatures, and questions. The police requested to see the property themselves and collect whatever residue might still remain. By late afternoon, uniformed officers were walking the perimeter of the yard, photographing the fence and the area around the pool. They found footprints in the damp earth near the back corner, where the intruder had climbed over, prints that matched the shoes worn by the neighbor in the video. Later that evening, a detective knocked on their door to inform them that the suspect had been brought in for questioning. He did not share many details, but confirmed that the man had been confronted with the footage. According to the detective, the neighbor had first denied everything, growing defensive and agitated. But as the evidence was laid out in front of him, his posture changed. Eventually, he admitted what he had done. He claimed that his anger over property disputes had gotten out of control, that he had only meant to scare them, that he never thought anyone would actually get hurt. Emily listened to this summary with a mixture of relief and revulsion. The idea that he had meant to frighten them, not harm them, offered no comfort. He had brought poison into their lives, had turned their place of rest into a battleground, and had done it all while exchanging neighborly nods by day. The detective assured them that charges would be filed: trespassing, criminal mischief, and reckless endangerment at the very least. There was even discussion of adding attempted poisoning, which could carry significant penalties. When the police finally left, the house was silent again. But it was a different kind of silence. Less fearful, more exhausted. Emily stood at the glass doors that looked out onto the yard, the faint green light of the cameras still blinking in the night. The pool was nearly empty now, the last of the contaminated water drained by a professional service that had arrived earlier in the day. The smell was mostly gone, though a faint sharpness lingered in the air, a reminder of what had been there. In the following days, they oversaw the thorough cleaning of the pool. Workers in protective gloves and masks scrubbed the tiles, replaced the filter system, and flushed the pipes. Each step felt like a ritual of purification, as though they were washing away the violation along with the chemical residue. Dan stayed outside through most of it, watching with folded arms, while Emily remained near the kitchen window, unable to look away. When at last the job was finished, the pool stood empty but clean, its plaster surface white and unblemished. A few days later, they refilled it with fresh water. The pump hummed quietly, the surface gradually rising, and Emily felt a strange combination of pride and grief. It looked as it had before, but it no longer meant the same thing. Neighbors came by with concerned questions once word of the arrest spread through the street. Some expressed shock, others admitted that they had seen signs of tension, but never imagined it would go so far. Emily accepted their sympathy with a polite smile, but inside she remained guarded. Trust had been broken in a way that could not be easily repaired. At night, she would still wake sometimes and glance at the camera's feeds on the phone beside the bed. There were no more intrusions, no more shadows by the fence, only the occasional stray cat or possum wandering across the lawn. Yet the vigilance had become part of their lives, a new habit that neither she nor Dan was ready to give up. One evening, as the sun was setting and the yard glowed with the last light of day, Emily stepped outside and stood by the pool. The water reflected the sky, turning gold and rose, rippling gently in the breeze. For a long moment, she simply watched it, listening to the quiet hum of the filter. She thought about how this place had once been purely a space of joy, a place for barbecues and laughter and summer afternoons. It was different now, but perhaps that was not entirely bad. There was a measure of strength in what they had done. They had faced the danger, uncovered the truth, and acted when they could have stayed silent. The yard would never feel as innocent as it once had, but it also felt more solid now, as though they had claimed it back from something dark. When Dan joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders, she leaned against him and let herself breathe. The cameras watched quietly from their corners, sentinels that would keep them safe. The pool rippled softly, a mirror of the sky, and for the first time in weeks, Emily felt that she could stand there without fear. The world had changed, and so had they, but the house was still theirs, and that mattered more than anything. If this story kept you watching until the very end, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.